Test, test. Hi, everybody. Good evening. Thanks for coming by on a very cold night. Welcome to the second event in our... Oh, I'm Mercy Abasirkov. I'm a professor in RTA School of Media and the director of the Studio for Media Activism and Critical Thought. So this is the second event in our Hacking the Culture Speakers series, in which we invite artists, activists, and theorists to speak on issues of media activism and social justice. We have two more events coming up after this, so please join us on March 2nd, March 5th to hear from local multimedia artist Rena Katz on her work in radio and performance as it intersects with queer affect, and on March 19th, a feminist gaming workshop with the collective Dames Making Games. And we have a sign-up sheet out in the hallway where you can leave us your email address, so we'll put you on our mailing list, as well as flyers for the studio. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing someone many of you know as a teacher here at Ryerson, or you may have seen one of her films on TV or at festivals. I first met Min Sook as my neighbor in Leslieville and slowly learned about her immense and impressive body of work from other people, because she's actually pretty modest. In the course that's attached to this series, Social Justice Media, we watched one of Min Sook's earlier films, El Contrato, last week, and we talked about Canada's immigration policies, which have, under the Harper government, have become increasingly restrictive and more focused on temporary rather than permanent migration. J. Adam Perry has described such policies as a relic of Canada's racist and colonial past. We also looked in the class at a fairly benign CBC news report on Vietnamese immigrants arriving at the airport and noted the deeply coded ways that Canadian standard media frames immigrants as assimilated, grateful, and westernized. Sunera Tuvani has talked about how gratitude is the only affect allowed immigrants in Canada. Perry goes on to say that one of the reasons for oppressive immigration policies in Canada is due, as they put it, to the state-sanctioned amputation of collective memory of Canada's racist past. So Min Sook is an artist engaged in both the work of memory, that artist's labor of recording and documenting, but also of dreaming, because what do you do with historical silence? How do you conjure hope and solidarity out of terrible events and shameful pasts? That's as much a work of the imagination as it is of documentation, a radical reimagining of citizenship and civil society. That these shifts in immigration policies are shaped by global corporate power makes the locality of Min Sook's work all the more important. So local, in fact, that I found myself raiding my closet last summer, bringing several dresses over to Min Sook's after she put out a call for frocks for the migrant women who would be attending a lesbian wedding of two of their own. I hope she got that on camera. I can't wait to see that on film. A few biographical works about Min Sook and her colleague, Chris Ramsarup, and then we'll pass the mic on to them. Min Sook Lee's filmography includes the Gemini-nominated El Contrato, which won the Cesar E. Chavez Black Eagle Award, which looks at the lives of Mexican migrant workers in Ontario, as well as Hogtown, an analysis of the politics of policing in Toronto City Hall, which won Best Canadian Documentary Prize at the Hot Docs Festival. She's the co-creator behind the comedy series She's the Mayor, and her latest documentary, The Real Inglorious Bastards, received a Canadian Screen Award for Best History Documentary in 2013. We're proud to have her here at Ryerson. She teaches documentary filmmaking and image arts at Ryerson University and is currently in production on a new feature documentary, Migrant Dreams, about the lives of migrant women workers in Canada. Min Sook will be joined after and during her talk by her colleague, Chris Ramsarup of Justicia for Migrant Workers, a grassroots advocacy group based in Toronto, Vancouver, and Mexico City. Comprised of migrant workers and allies, they fight for the interests of workers in Canada's Temporary Foreign Workers Program. Chris has been organizing around these issues for 15 years, and he'll be talking a little bit about his work. And after this presentation, we'll open up the floor to questions and comments. So please join me in welcoming Min Sook Lee and Chris Ramsarup.
Thanks so much, Marcia. Yeah, thanks for organizing this space for us to talk and inviting me up here to share the work I'm doing and the work I'm doing with Chris Ramsruben in concert with Justicia. Thanks for you to come out. How many people in the room are filmmakers or artists? Yeah. And how many are activists engaged in social change movements? This is great. Perfect. Because one of the things, what I wanted to explore with you tonight, and I don't often get a space to do that with Chris, in dialogue with Chris, is looking at how filmmakers and media producers, storytellers, what role we play in a broader movement for social change. And in my case specifically, looking at justice for migrant workers. And I often see the work I do as working in concert with allies and in solidarity with a broader movement, and it's not in a silo. So, like many documentary filmmakers, I work on projects that I hope can be used as a tool for social change. And I have hopes for my films that I work on. I hope that, first of all, they work as films, that they engage, that they move, that they are good stories, that people are involved in the viewing experience and feel emotionally and intellectually challenged. I hope they work on that level. And then I want my films to inform people about situations and issues that they may not know about or they want to learn more about. I hope that the films I create are bridges, create bridges of solidarity between communities. And I often imagine the viewer and seeing the viewer having a connection with a story or a situation or an experience or another person that they wouldn't necessarily have met in their own lives, in their immediate circles, but recognizing solidarities, linkages, and building an empathy, but also building a sense of recognition too of a larger human story. And I think at first glance, many of us don't see the commonalities that we have, but I really do want my films to create a sense of, a broader sense of a unity of the human experience, and that's a big goal, but that's still up there, one of my hopes. And I also believe, when I'm making the documentaries that I do, I'm hoping to build a context that allows for kind of an insight into our own lives and our own experiences, a societal, political, economic, broader insight into those bigger contexts of our lives. But finally, the documentaries I make, I believe, one of my goals is to mobilize people. I don't want the documentaries to be a passive viewing experience where someone watches a documentary and feels, oh, I've learned that, and maybe get a credit out of it, maybe feel that somehow they've done a humanitarian good from watching a film. I've hoped that the documentaries push the viewer beyond that and recognize a kind of engagement beyond just a neutral, passive experience, but the interconnectedness between the viewer, the lives that are, and the stories that are being told, and how hopefully the viewing experience is intellectually and emotionally engaging, that it moves the viewer towards political action, engagement, advocacy. So those are a lot of big hopes, obviously. And I don't know that I reach all of them, but those are the kinds of ambitions I have when I start out on a project. The project I'm currently working on is about the lives of migrant women workers in Canada. And I'm not going to be very specific about the story right now because there's a lot of sensitivities that are occurring with the storyline of the people who I'm shooting with. So I'll just say that I'm shooting in Ontario and the workers are in the foreign worker program and they work in the food and agricultural industries. But there are many vulnerabilities that workers encounter in their own working lives, being here in the foreign worker program, but especially when they participate in the documentary process. And I think that challenge is something that filmmakers and media producers are constantly negotiating and asking, what are the risks and what are the stakes? And who's taking the risk? And what's my accountability? And what is my relationship to these individuals who are sharing their stories with me right now, in this moment, in this time? And when does that relationship end? I actually believe it doesn't end. And I realize I've learned that through a lifetime of working on documentaries. And I think I can specifically speak about the 15 years I've been working on different stories about migrant workers. So this particular project I'm filming, I've been shooting it for about a year and a half, and I hope that it'll be done by the end of this year. Hopefully it'll be in film festivals, in schools, on television, and I hope it hits the kinds of goals I spoke about earlier. And the project looks at how migrant workers in Canada are treated under our temporary labor programs and questions what roots they have for advocacy in a labor program that's designed to keep them permanently temporary, and in which their legal status is tied to their relationship with their employer, and oftentimes with a private broker who facilitates their entry into Canada and their engagement in the labor program. I want to play for you a short film I created for the Mayworks Film Festival, and this short film has got the title Migrant Dreams. It's about Mexican women who work in Ontario, to give you a sense of some of the storytelling I do. And it's got the title Migrant Dreams, so not to confuse you, the feature documentary I'm currently shooting is also called Migrant Dreams, but that's a working title that will have to be replaced, obviously. But why don't I start by playing for you this short 10-minute film to give you an idea of the stories that I do.
Me vine para acá y cuando yo llegué acá, te digo, el sufrimiento fue por los hijos porque se quedaban, pero la fortaleza está ahí, trabajas y trabajas, porque es difícil trabajar aquí, porque muchas personas piensan, se va a Canadá, así recoge el dinero. No, tienes que trabajar, ¿cuántas horas? A lo mejor 10, 12 horas parada, caminando, sin sentarte. Es pesado, pero es que yo tengo que poder. La fortaleza está en uno mismo, en que tú tengas las ganas, el deseo, la fuerza de salir adelante. Nadie da pasos en balde, ni hay quien viva de ilusiones, y unas ganas por lo que hacer. Yo también quiero ganar. Entonces los compañeros me propusieron de que les hiciera de comer, y yo salía de trabajar y yo les hacía comida. Yo les vendía comida, pero eran las ganas de hacer un poquito más de dinero para poder hacer algo allá en Veracruz, en mi pueblo. Yo no tenía nada, yo no tenía una casa, yo no tenía nada, mis hijos, les digo, dormían en una cama de que eran de palos. Le digo, eran palos y arriba tenían cartón y arriba del cartón una cobija. Otro amor. Mi meta era venir aquí y levantar mi casa. Y la levanté. Soy el negro me destapa, ¿qué será lo que quieren ellos? Lejanas nomás, por ti preguntaré a sus praderas y flores tienen tu boca. Por ahí trae tu platita, te dejo de gardenia, perfume del amor.
Este país es muy hermoso y es mi primera temporada que yo vengo y que veo nevar. ¿Ya? ¡Ay! 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 ¡Ay!
A la 1, a las 2. No grites tanto, tú se lee, esté tranquila, por favor. Conéctala ya, no sé.
Yo le dije a mi esposo que yo no sabía cuántos meses vengo. Como otras 2 temporadas he venido 2 meses. A hoy son 6 meses. Si yo le haya dicho cuando esté allá, a lo mejor me iba a decir, ya no vayas porque es mucho tiempo. Yo digo, bueno, que pase un mes más y ya a lo mejor ya le digo que son 6 meses. Yo me vine con mi tía. Pero ya faltan 5 meses. No más. Así.
Yo no sabía que había llegado embarazada. Me fui sintiendo mal y todo eso. Sentía que me iban a regresar y todo eso. Entonces yo traté de ocultarlo y todo. Sentía que si yo les decía me iban a mandar para México. Y yo quería terminar mi contrato. Se enteraron por las compañeras. Empezaban a murmurar, a decir que estaba embarazada y se reían mucho de mí. Pues el hecho de burlarse y vivir uno junto como que sí es frustrante. Porque el cuarto y aquí la cocina tenía uno que rozar siempre. Siempre estaba uno así, en contacto. Entonces, pues sí me sentía yo muy mal. Cuando la patrona supo, no, me preguntó y yo sí fui sincera con ella, que sí estaba embarazada. Y ya me dijo que me iba a mandar a México. Se portó bien conmigo porque me ayudó a cargar mis maletas. Me dio, cuando estábamos en el aeropuerto, $100. Bueno, a lo mejor no es mucho, ¿verdad? Pero el detalle sí es bonito. Ya ahí en esa farma estuve 4 años trabajando y papá de mi hijo pues es de México y yo le hablé y ya cuando supo que yo estaba embarazada pues me dejó sola y pues fue como que más pesado todo esto. Sí, Dejar a mi hijo fue muy demasiado difícil, está muy pequeño. Ya el último día que me venía yo, sí sentía que ya dije no puedo dejarlo, no tengo fuerza. Y me puse a llorar, pero tuve que dejarlo. Y ahora estoy aquí, tengo que echarle ganas.
El bebé está ahorita durmiendo.
Mi mamá no, dice que les hago falta, que yo debo de estar con ellos, que va a pasar el tiempo y todo lo bonito no lo voy a poder vivir con ellos.
También cuídate.
Que todo se va a ir, o sea, es muy difícil porque está uno en que te vienes para sacar adelante a tus hijos, pero igual el corazón lo traes destrozado.
Es una persona que tiene una familia, tiene una esposa, tiene unos hijos. Es muy difícil. Y sería tonto de mi parte pensar que es una relación que sí, él se va a casar conmigo y va a dejar a su familia, no. Y nunca he pretendido eso. Siempre yo les he dicho, mis respetos para tu familia, para tu esposa, para tus hijos. Y nunca te haría daño, nunca te causaría un daño con tu familia. Son cosas que yo siempre le he dicho a las mujeres, son amores de Canadá y lo que hay en Canadá aquí se queda. Es raro un 1%, un 2% que se llegue por así a hacer un matrimonio. Hay que tener bien puestos los pantalones o los pies sobre la tierra de pensar que él es casado, de que es aquí y nada más. Y no perturbar cuando él está en México, en su casa. Si bien te habla, qué bueno, y si no puede llamarte, te aguantas, porque todo es aquí. ¡Acá arriba! Todavía nos maltratan, ay, no entiendo la verdad.
En el aeropuerto cuando llegamos, las mujeres te comen con los ojos.
Yo no sé por qué las mujeres se enojan, decía una compañera. El hombre se enferma aquí y ahí estamos nosotras, prestas a ayudarnos. Que ya les damos de comer porque pobrecito llega cansado. Y cuando se van a México llegan bien...
Luego tienen bien cuidados.
Bien cuidados. Y todavía les sabe algo de nosotros y se enoja. Nos maltrata. ¿Por qué?
Tienen frío y pues vamos a...
Los cobijamos. O sea, no entiendo por qué las esposas no tienen tanto coraje.
Aquí tenemos, bueno, aquí tengo otra familia. Cuando vengo a Canadá es mi familia también y se las presento. Ella se llama Evelyn. Hola Evelyn.
Hola.
Todo.
Muy bien.
Ella se llama May.
Hola.
Y ella, ¿cómo se llama?
Robin.
Robin.
So this short film was played at Mayworks Festival, and it was partnered with a visual installation and art exhibit that Deb Barnes, who's an artist, academic, and activist, created around making an homage to migrant workers. And the film paired with the exhibit traveled. It played at the Mayworks Festival, but it also traveled to art galleries, community centers, and was used by food sustainability organizations across Canada, actually. And the filming that I did with Alejandra, who's the main woman whose story you hear about in the documentary, I've been filming her for about a year, and I expect to film with her for a much longer period of time. It's hard to know when I'll stop. And to me, you know, to be able to tell the story of what it's like to work and live in Canada for 2 decades, raising children at home, 8 months here, 4 months back, the kind of resilience and how then your life becomes completely changed, and how you build power from that base of, you know, a systemic, so many systemic inequities that you're facing. To me, that's part of Alejandra's story. And you'll notice, I hope, the kind of intimacy the woman shared with the camera: joy, sadness, strength, a range of emotions, humor, and an intimacy that comes from the person who worked with me on the film, Evelyn and Galata Grez. And Evelyn is a co-founder of Justicia for Migrant Workers. She worked with me as a translator, but translating with Alejandra and her co-workers. But more than that, Evelyn has a relationship with the woman in that house, with Alejandra, that's over a decade long. And the trust and the friendship and that Alejandra has with Evelyn was transferred to me because Evelyn trusts me, Alejandra trusted me. And it's a very special relationship between myself and Evelyn. And it's something that I think as filmmakers, as media makers, there's it constantly needs to be negotiated and understood just where the power imbalances lie, where in the process maybe the process diverges, when the goals are congruent. Those are things that we talk about all the time. And this brings me to Justicia for Migrant Workers. And Justicia is an organization and that is the organization that brought me to working on migrant worker issues. The first feature film I ever directed is called El Contrato, and I made it as a novice filmmaker with the National Film Board of Canada. And it tells a story about a group of Mexican migrant workers in Ontario. I want to play for you a few scenes from the film. If you wanted to see the whole film, you could watch it on the NFB's site. And you could see a bit of the story in El Contrato.
And live in close quarters.
Bueno, saludo a todo Veracruz, a toda la familia. Espero que algún día me miren. Aquí estamos trabajando en Canadá. Aquí estamos sufriendo, poquito. Espero que los paisanos que vengan la pasen mejor que yo, que estemos aquí.
Esta es mi familia. Aquí la componen mi esposa y mis dos hijos. Pásame a tu hermana, a ver, la quiero conocer. Oh, hey, cuñado. ¿Por qué vienes aquí a Canadá? Yo en lo personal vengo por necesidad, ¿no? Muchos venimos aquí porque no tenemos casa o porque no tenemos nada, ¿no?
Yo vine con el propósito de venir 2, 3 temporadas nada más. Pues es muy triste porque cada vez que tú regresas a México es más difícil la situación en México y desgraciadamente se impone uno al salario de este país, que es un poquito mejor, pero vaya.
They're wanted as laborers, not citizens. The program only accepts men who are married, with less than a grade school education and with strong ties to families at home. Men who will go back after months of painful separation.
En nuestra provincia el salario es si no más recuerdo, el más bajo de la República Mexicana. Entonces lo que nos hace, no nomás a mí, ¿no? Lo personal, sino a muchos vecinos y demás, venir a esta provincia. Lo personal, por mis hijos, que están estudiando ahorita, que estando aquí es un poquito más tranquilo para ellos. Para mí es más difícil, ¿no? Porque a cambio de eso tengo que pagar a no verlos durante 8 meses. La pequeñita pues es la que dice mejor no te vayas, ¿no? Pero vaya, ella apenas tiene 9 años.
Bueno.
Hola, buenas noches.
Hola.
¿Quién habla?
Yo.
¿Quién yo?
Yo.
Pues ¿quién yo?
Pues yo.
Bueno, pues pásame a tu mamá, yo famosito, que vienes con los angelitos.
Hola.
Hola, buenas noches, señora. ¿Cómo está todo?
¿Eh?
¿Sí? Les describo todo tal y como está. porque sí me preguntan mucho, principalmente la más pequeña. Ella me dice cómo es la gente de allá, cómo le haces para pedir las cosas si tú no hablas inglés, pues.
When I first bought the place, I said, when are you the busiest? Because I want to know how the business was. And he said, come see me Friday night about 6 o'clock. And I did. And I was surprised how many Mexicans were here and how many came. And it was amazing. It was just amazing to be able to do 300 or 400 customers in a couple-hour period, you know. It brings a lot of money to the area, you know, Leamington area. I mean, some people, I think, complain, but for me, I'm happy. Other businesses in town, I know, they complain that on Friday nights, maybe there's too much commotion downtown, or well, if you were a person from this town and you came in my store on a Friday night, a lot of people would leave.
Not to say they're taking over, but hey, there's a big chunk of these guys around. I know a lot of people are really, really uncomfortable about it. Like, they're like, oh my God, they're all over the place. You know, I mean, they're human beings, but when you're not used to something, it's like walking into Mexico, they say, you know what I mean? Not to be prejudiced or anything, but I mean, that's what it is.
For me, who understands their value, I don't think anything. I think, yeah, whatever. And the town goes out of its way to accommodate. You know, occasionally there'll be some that are maybe inebriated, and the policemen just kind of call their owners and ask them to come and pick them up and that kind of thing.
There was a guy from PEI they used to call Potato. He met this young Leamington, Ontario tomato, but he had eyes for other girls and she was a little mushy. So he said, don't fence me wet, but no sense being fussy.
2, 1, stop!
The annual Tomato Festival in Leamington. And so El Contrato was released by the NFB only after a year of being embargoed because of a libel lawsuit that growers who were in the documentary launched against myself and the producers of the NFB. And TVO was a broadcaster that was interested in broadcasting it, but they wouldn't because of the legal challenge. So for a year, the film was just on the shelf while I went through legal battles. But the film itself has eventually been released, was broadcast on TVO, and it's been used in schools and played in very diverse settings. And it's Justicia for Migrant Workers, Chris Ramsarup, who started the project for me because of a conversation, a chance conversation that we had in Kensington Market. So I want to bring Chris now into the conversation, and maybe I'll have a seat to make this a bit more normal. Because I'm always trying to work out just what is the relationship we have as artists, as media producers with social movements, and what are the challenges we face, and how are the films we create constructive tools, and when can these opportunities build in a bigger sense. So Chris, when I vividly remember running into you in Kensington Market one afternoon, and you were like, I'm organizing a fact-finding bus tour to Leamington.
Why don't you actually say the way I told you?
Yo, Sook, yo. Yo, what's up? And then you were like, come, what are you doing on the weekend? Because you're always organizing, Chris. But I didn't know very much about migrant workers. And you were organizing a bus of journalists, of writers, and media producers to go to Leamington. So I wonder whether you could give me and the room a bit of the background context of that moment of organizing around migrant justice? Because this was even before Justicia was formed, right?
So I think even, do I need this or? Yeah, oh, sadly. All right, so I guess before even talking about that, because I came out of student activism, I'm hoping many people here are engaged in their campuses and organizing around their campuses. And the reason why I'm starting off that way, it's the understanding that the role that we have as students and as community people is looking at the universities, looking at colleges as a place of transformation and linking to what's happening in the outside community. So very much as a student activist, I was a troublemaker on campus, and I used to have fun, occupying offices, protesting, disrupting. And then I was involved in a internship program through the Canadian Labour Congress, and working also with the United Farm Workers of America, where we became aware. And I guess aware is kind of a sad word in one sense, but aware of the situation that was happening right here in Ontario. And it was a phone call that we received. The United Farm Workers of America is a big union in the United States, and involved in a lot of campaigns in California. The work of Ontario was more about providing support to the Americans at that time. And there wasn't any real on-the-ground organizing happening. And we received a call about a wildcat strike. And do people here know what a wildcat strike is? Anybody? Okay, does anybody want to raise their hand if they do know?
Winnie.
Okay. Sure. So a lot of the times we look at it as withholding labor. So there is a set of rules that govern how strikes happen. And there are certain communities, such as farm workers, who don't have a right to organize, don't have a right to form unions, and don't have a right to strike. And there was a group of Mexican workers who had had enough. They were fed up of the way they were being treated. And basically, the straw that broke the camel's back was something to do with living conditions. And they had struck, their employer took them to the church and basically said that the church is a local community, and the church is also an important symbolic site of organizing and where people gather, and basically said that you guys are no longer working here, you have to go back to where you come from. And we had found out after the fact about that. We went as a fact-finding delegation, and as organizers, we know that we have to, and basically I'm not using the organizers as an elitist term, it's basically something we all do every day. We look to our community, we look to people around us. And I looked to different friends of mine. Some people were people I partied with, I went drinking with. Some guys and sisters are people I did undergrad with. Some people were involved in the same internship programs. And other people were progressive academics, progressive filmmakers. And I thought it was important twofold. One was to expose and to see what was happening on. Because I couldn't believe, just this vivid picture of exploitation, but also as somebody of Caribbean ancestry, vivid picture of indentureship. And something that I could look into the eyes of the people around and say, yeah, these could be my family members. And I thought that story was important to see and important to connect. And the only way I thought about doing so was having other people have the ability to see what was going on and to try to also tell that story. So I think that's why that happened, was to break that invisibility, two, to show the support and solidarity that there were other people that are concerned about this issue, and to break the isolation. And it was quite clear from being in those spaces how isolating it was.
And it's interesting because I remember that summer, for some reason, there was a lot of media coverage on migrant workers. Now, I'm not, in particular, in that region, in the Windsor Star, at that time, there was a labor reporter, Mary Agnes Welch. And, she did a big, 4-page spread, kind of an expose investigation report on the health consequences of migrant workers being exposed to pesticides, not being trained properly. And I remember reading that around the same time that you were organizing fact-finding trip, and contacting her and finding more of my, doing more of my research and building my research, talking to her. But subsequently, shortly after El Contrato was released, she was moved from the labor beat. They got rid of the labor beat at Windsor Store altogether. They now have a business reporter, a strong business section, but that beat doesn't even exist anymore. And she now writes, I think it's, entertainment and, community affairs in one of the Western provinces, which, when you talk about media, reporting stories in our own backyards, Sometimes it's much easier for Canadian documentary filmmakers, Canadian storytellers to travel across seas, point fingers at situations that are very far from home. When you are looking at our own backyard, stories in which your family members may be implicated, the towns that you grew up in, things get a lot more heated, a lot more sensitive.
Yeah, totally agree. I think that we're easy at looking at the problems of the outside world, number one, without understanding what's happening here, but also the constant relationship, right? And through, the key phrase word that many people want to start off with, globalization, but I think for many of us it goes back to slavery, and it goes back to colonialism and the role of capitalism in developing a society which is very disjointed. So I think that it's a starting point where we choose, and we do deliberately choose to ignore what's happening around us, and we also choose to position the story that that we're somehow innocent about all the exploitation that's happening around us.
Now, I want to talk about the fallout of El Contrato and the impact and how it has been used, and where it's used in addition to the other organizing, the Justicia, but other groups also do, the UFW and such. So as I mentioned, there was a legal challenge, and that took about a year. The lawsuit named myself. They wanted $1 million. Thankfully, I didn't have it, so I didn't have to worry about losing $1 million. But any exhibition of the film was, we couldn't do that for about a year. But at the same time, different people who were in the film faced consequences. So Father Murphy, who was a pastor at the Catholic Church in Leamington, he had services, Spanish language services for the migrant workers, Mexican migrant workers. And he was always sort of on a fine line in pissing off the employers because he was suspected of being too sympathetic to the migrant workers. He had a program, a bike program, giving safety lights to migrant workers because every year there is a highway accident. Workers don't have transportation. They don't have access to cars. So many use bicycles, are using the bicycles to go from isolated farms into town at night. So that's a serious safety consequence. So he had a safety program giving bikes and reflective tape to migrant workers. And after the film was released, because he allowed me to film in the church, he was then subsequently moved to another diocese. And they put in a more neutral priest in that church. Number two, Denton Hoffman, who was the executive director of the Ontario Greenhouse Vegetable Growers Association, which represented, it's an umbrella group representing the interests of the growers in the region. He gave me an interview, and I don't think he looked that great in it, where he acknowledged there are problems in our program, but we're trying to, we're not perfect, but we're trying to do better. And he was fired from his post and moved to another region. And then there were two Mexican consulate officials who were in the documentary. And in one scene, you clearly see the way in which class privilege, race privilege within Mexican society itself is played out within the temporary foreign worker program. Because many of the Mexican men were indigenous and coming from rural areas and coming into Canada and working in Canada, when they were trying to access support, they would reach out to the consulate, the Mexican consulate, for some support. Instead, they're constantly told, you don't like it here, go back. You're here for a reason, and if you don't like the deal that's given to you, that you pay taxes, and that you don't recoup most of those benefits, if you don't like the living conditions, if you don't like the way you're treated, just go back. And that was essentially the pat response we got from the consulate representatives. And two of those men were removed from their post. And then subsequently, after the doc was released, Leamington has a very high concentration of migrant workers probably in Canada. Now Tarzan's competes, but Leamington is pretty high. And a lot of Mexican workers. And at that time, they didn't have a Mexican consular office. But after El Contrato was released, they opened one up to make some kind of effort to service the population. So those were direct fallout from the film, but for the workers themselves who are in the documentary, want to talk about that?
So I guess maybe before I get to the workers in the documentary, I want to spend a few minutes doing a couple things. So I just want to quickly review kind of the structure of the program. I think there's two aspects that people seem to, sorry, I feel like I'm turning my back on everybody. Sorry about that. So I guess there's two aspects that people two things that need to challenge. One, people just come here because they've got nothing else to do in their countries, in their home countries. They're just poor, looking for freedom in Canada, number one. And number two, that somehow they just don't know their rights in Canada. So it's two myths I want to dispel and to start off the conversation. So I want people to always remember that people are tied to an employer. They don't have labor social mobility, meaning they don't have the ability to be free, to move, to change jobs. Number three, they have to return back to their home countries. And many people are basically forced to leave their home countries because of, many were former farmers, but because of the different trade agreements that have happened, because of the way that their local economies have been disfigured because of World Bank policies and IMF policies, this is what's leading to people coming to be employed in programs like this. And I think that context is very important in how we do our organizing and how we do work on the ground. And very much, it is, and when they censored, and we can say they censored Min Sook's film, this was a deliberate strategy. And many of us are familiar with slap suits. And slap suits are when people in power try to make sure that stories are suppressed or ideas are suppressed so that the weight of the topic is basically neutralized. And this was a policy and a strategy by the employer organizations to try to suppress the story of migrant workers here in Ontario or across Canada. It sounds a little sometimes conspiracy theorish, but if you understand that there has always been a consistent strategy, particularly with agricultural workers, both here in Canada and the United States, to make sure that those voices don't get out, and to see as a larger employer way of trying to control labor and control that from getting out. So that's the first part of this I wanted to erase. The second part relating to what happened with both Theo and Juan, Theodoro and Juan from the documentary, is also very much, sorry?
Maybe, let me just, with Teodoro, Teodoro Bello Martinez is the main character, the main person with which much of the story happens in El Contrato. And then Juan is a person who did interviews with me, but he chose to not identify himself. He chose to be anonymous. And at the time when we were doing the interview with him, didn't really know what would be the best choice creatively to make him anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
And I often regret it. I chose a J-Claw because that was the only thing there at the support center. But I often go, oh God, I don't know if, does that ever bother you? I don't know.
No.
Anyways, it's always bothered me. So those two choose to be in the documentary, and the stakes with which what the risk that they took to be in the film, I think needs to be really outlined, because participation in SOP, the Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, means that as a worker, you are only brought back into the country and into the program when the employer gives you a good grade. And after your 8-month stint here, workers get a sealed envelope from the employer, and in that is essentially their report. And then they go back to the Ministry of Labor, and then that's opened up before them, and then, that's when their future is decided upon. So the extreme power employers have over workers' ability to work in the program cannot be underscored. Not just their being in the program, but their mobility, their housing, their access to health care, their access to favorable jobs. Maybe you can speak more about just the power imbalance between the employer and the worker, which is really nothing like most Canadian workers ever experience in their own job sites.
So once again, for us, we look at the law as constructing the vulnerability. The fact that people are tied to an employer, there's restrictive immigration policies at the federal level, and at the provincial level, there's lots and lots of crappy provincial laws that don't protect workers. And you've got this huge monster of a legal system that constructs workers as indentured workers. And when workers do attempt to try to stand up for the rights, in many cases, they're basically sent back home. When they're injured, they're sent back home. So part of the work over the last 15 years has been trying to figure out how to take steps to work around that. How do we resist? How do we try to fight back where, one, workers have the ability to continue to work, And for those workers who are no longer here, that their stories are told, and their stories are told to help build on a longer legacy. And Theodoto and Juan, thankfully, are still with us, and they still are organizing in different spaces. And I guess I want to start with a quote by Theodoto, very recent, and then maybe get into the organizing work attached to the film. So how many people have seen El Contrato here, first of all? All right, so everybody's seen it. Okay, that's good. So y'all remember Theodoto? Anybody? Who's Theodoto? Which one? Dude with glasses. Yeah, you. All right, so Theodoto has been, he's been in Leamington now for about 14 or 15 years. Before that, he was in Quebec. He's been in different places, but he's remained to work in Leamington area. And so the program that Sook profiled in the documentary was the Seasoned Agriculture Worker Program, which each one of us knows about. At the time of the documentary, the growers and the government were beginning to talk about the low-scale program, which brings the whole McDonald's, Tim Hortons stuff that's going on right now. So the inception was around that particular time. And Theodoto, reflecting on Leamington about 3 or 4 years ago, said this, that Leamington's a beautiful place. It's a nice place. Growers, it's like a United Nations. Growers can pick and choose workers from any country of the world to come to work in their fields. And for me, that was extremely poignant, right? Because that talked for me of the expansion and how very much the temporary foreign worker program and its expansion has enabled employers to expand their control of their workforces by basically replacing one group of workers with another group of workers, having in the same greenhouse of 150 workers, people who are non-status, people who are coming through a 2-year contract, people who are coming through an 8-month contract, people who are recent immigrants, people who are of Mennonite ancestry. So you're having all these type of people, and not only do they use labor control as a form of social control, but they use immigration laws as a social control. And I think Theo was getting at that when we're looking at that in that particular space. So that's extremely poignant, extremely important, reflecting on what he sees and some of the work that I guess we were seeing in places like Leamington.
Yeah, and when Chris was talking originally, when I met Chris, he was organizing the fact-finding tour for the Wildcat strike in Leamington. And what happened with that Wildcat strike? Workers took to the streets. Do you want to?
Well, they basically withheld their labor. And the group of the workers were banned. I believe it was between 20 to 30. Some of the workers were banned permanently from the program, and others actually weren't. Others were able to find their way back to work in Ontario. So it's trying to figure out the nuances where some people are able to use the different forms of exploitation of the program to their advantage to find ways to get back in Canada, but there are tremendous insurmountable risks for many others who are banned permanently from the program. And I guess some of the reasons we found out why people get banned are having relationships, interracial relationships. That's such a big no-no, isn't it? Being injured at work, asking for a pee break, complaining about pesticides. So these are some of the reasons that people are basically being disbarred from coming back ever to work in Canada. So I think that's also an important part of this larger context. Now, getting to the documentary. So there's one thing, having Chris Ramsey come and speak to 70, 80 people about what he sees, I guess, every weekend as he goes on his joyrides in Southern Ontario. But I think the most critically important part has been the voices of the workers and having that documentary, having that ability for the workers to express in their own words what's happening. And I think that there's so many different important forms of resistance just by that documentary being made. And having the ability to reach, I think, maybe over 1 million people at this point in time, right? So hundreds of thousands of screenings, not only for communities themselves, so communities across Ontario have seen this documentary, but also in showing with the workers. And having the conversation with the workers about, look, this is something that happened 15 years ago. What has changed? What has remained the same? What can you take from the documentary that you can talk about your particular experiences? What would you want to change? Theodoto, for instance, still comes out to different events. And he also serves as an important community leader / organizer in raising some of the issues. So that's the first part. Second of all is bootleg. Wow. So when El Contrato came out, and before the NFB had copies, all the bootleggers in Leamington had copies, and most of the workers had copies of the stuff too. So the fact that they're able to show that, the fact that they're able to share that when they went back to their home countries was also really, really important. So I think that to visualize about the experiences, number one, this was such an important documentary. Two, it gave a space for people to resist. Three, the criticism that people had about the documentary, I remember a couple years afterwards, was that, well, this is an old story. Things have improved. It's no longer like this anymore in Leamington, Ontario, because the growers, out of their benevolency, have taken the necessary steps to improve the working and living conditions of migrant workers. Sadly to say, just watching that clip, particularly in downtown Leamington, very much the same type of conditions exist today where local cities are trying to pass bylaws to prevent migrant workers from loitering in the downtown area. Migrant workers are still feared as sexual threats to local communities. And just today, I was reading the Windsor Star because there was a very similar activity around a plant and trying to build accommodations for migrant workers. And the similar types of tropes about the threat of migrant workers, the uncomfortability about people being in the downtown area when brown and black people are around, the same idea is happening 15 or 20 years later. So the documentary is still extremely relevant. It still speaks to what's happening on the ground.
Yeah, well, just last summer, the mayor of Leamington and a few city councillors, well, Jason, you were there, you shot some of that. The mayor of Leamington was speaking out saying that the Jamaican migrant workers are sexually harassing the white women in town, and that, he was on CBC saying, well, this may be okay in their culture, but they're here and they need to follow by Canadian rules here. And the suggestion was that maybe they should create some kind of zoning bylaws to physically contain where migrant workers were because women didn't feel safe, right? So yeah, the discussion is very much happening. So considering what Chris outlined, the risk involved in speaking out and advocating for your voice, why would a worker participate in film? Why would they put themselves out there? And I think it's, there's complicated reasons why anyone would be in a documentary. Even if you didn't have stakes or risk, why would anyone agree to having their own privacy, their own personal lives, put out there? But I think the salient ones for what we're talking about is about Teodoto, absolutely, and Juan, the other worker who was featured in the film, were very clear that what they were going through, they didn't want other workers to experience. They wanted to see change. And I think this is when you are able to build a relationship with people and you can collectively identify that let's work with this medium together. So I don't see myself as reporting on, but working with. And I don't know that I was that conscious about that process 15 years ago, because I was just kind of straight out of the gate, but much more so now, 15 years later, working in this medium. But I realized that intuitively my process back then, and much more so consciously now, it's about working with and figuring out a consent that's co-created, the space that's co-created. So some of the most powerful scenes I find in the film are scenes that Teodoto suggested. There's one scene where he is singing happy birthday to his son at a payphone, and he hasn't had the chance to share a birthday with his son in over now 2 decades. But what he does do is wake him up at 6 in the morning and sing happy birthday to him.
I think similarly too with organizing. So. Yeah. It's not necessarily that we're just these outsiders from Toronto who know everything, right? Or that we know all the games or tools about organizing, because we absolutely don't. And if you think about that, and if you're going to go approach a community and have that attitude, you're screwed. Just don't do it, right? It's very much about this consensual relationship, understanding where people are at, and organizing where people are at as well too. It's not saying that, yes, I've got all these ideas, you're going to listen to me. Right? It's got to be a reciprocal relationship. And very much what you said about Evelyn, I think whether it's documentary making, whether it's if you do print journalism, whether you do community organizing, it's trust and it's building relationships, and it takes a hell of a long time. When people first saw us, all of us here, and I'm sure many of you have had the same experiences in the work that you're doing, people want to know what the hell you're doing. Who are you? What are you here for? Are you here to profit off of me? Are you here to make a buck or to get some academic credentials and to leave me behind? And I think that especially during the toughest times with workers, whether it's the organizing or being involved in the documentary, that there is a process where you keep in touch, that you keep coming out, you keep showing your face, and that you provide tangible results. I think that's extremely critical. in the case of the documentary, the tangible result was that the story was getting out there, that steps were being tried to make sure that other people don't go through the same type of traumatic experiences that both Theo and Juan went through.
Yeah, and there's another scene where I know Teodoro. Oh, anyways, with the birthday scene, that was Teodoro's suggestion. He said to me, come over to my house at 5 in the morning. I said, why, Teodoro? And he wouldn't tell me. He just said, just come, you'll see. And then he called his son, and he knew the power of that moment, and he knew how to share that in a way that was really special. But then there was another scene later on when he returned back to Mexico, and the report at the Ministry of Labor, when you're assessed, when you're graded, he confronted the official at the desk, the person who's sort of the intake person, who's like, how was your treatment in Canada? Generally, the expectation is that the worker is compliant, subservient, and everything was fine. Don't say anything. But Teodoro, knowing that the camera was there as a witness and using it, I know, consciously as a weapon, essentially, confronted this official bureaucrat, said, you know what, my experience in Canada was terrible. I am a worker who deserves dignity and respect, and I don't think anyone should have that kind of treatment. And I remember her response was so patronizing because, again, the class and the race divisions, the language that she used, she said to him, well, she used a word, don't have these kinds of outbursts, these petulant outbursts, talking down to him as though she was shocked that he would actually speak out and register a complaint about the way in which he was treated. And when I was filming there, I remember getting access to the Ministry of Labor was difficult, but because I had the NFB as the producer of the documentary, I used that. This is an agency of the federal government, so trying to pass myself off as some sort of quasi-official, state filmmaker, which I so clearly was not. But with that, under the guise of that, then I'm able to, film a moment there. And I remember when he was saying this to her in that engagement, we were filming it, there were all these other bureaucrats kind of flustered and, circling us and wringing their hands, can this be captured on Canadian television? And that whole scene was orchestrated by Teodoro. So in terms of co-creating, yeah, I think that it's extremely important. Now, what's funny and interesting is in some screenings of this documentary, some of the responses, because I also realized that the viewing experience is never neutral, and it's never the same. It's depending on who's watching this film and what they're bringing to it. And we all have our subjectivities that we bring into the viewing experience. And I remember one time when we were screening it on the 10th anniversary at Brickworks. Yeah. And someone said, did you choose Teodoro as a character because he doesn't look like a migrant worker? I thought, really? What does a migrant worker look like? And that said so much to me about representation, how it gets cemented, stereotypes and ideas of whose voice comes forward. And the person who spoke said, well, he's well-spoken, he wears glasses, he looks like an office worker. Your ideas of what a migrant worker is, or who a migrant worker is, or how articulate a migrant worker is, there's so much parlayed in that. And interestingly enough, oftentimes I will get the question, well, you're not Spanish speaking, you're not from that community, why would you care? Why would you tell this story? And again, it's back to subjectivities and voice and representation and authorship. As a filmmaker, as a media producer, when you are a woman of color, I'm an immigrant, somehow it's decided that there are certain stories I'm allowed to tell and other stories that don't belong to me. And yet the tradition of mainstream storytelling has been straight white men are okay to tell everyone's story, but I can tell the Korean immigrant story, and that's kind of where I should stay, right? And I find it very interesting that when I take up space as a filmmaker in spaces that don't immediately seem mine, then my authority is questioned. So recently I did a documentary about World War II Jewish resistance fighters during World War II, filming that in Austria. And again, I encountered it quite a bit because this was a story about Jewish resistance fighters during fighting against the Nazis. And well, why would a Korean woman be interested in telling this story? I'm interested in resistance. I'm interested in how social movements and people fight back. And with migrant workers, what Chris was saying, immediately saw his family. I definitely saw my family with the Mexican migrant workers. I saw mirrored my father's experience, my relatives' experience of not being able to speak the language, feeling completely outside, feeling completely dehumanized at every exchange, And there are many ways in which I got that without the language. But Evelyn Encolado Grez was critical to shooting out Contrato because she worked as interpreter, but more so, she was the person who sustained the deep human relationship with the people I was filming with, because there are limits that I had. And I think as filmmakers and media creators, when you are working in alliance with community organizers, to respect that relationship and understand places you can't go, places you actually don't belong in, or when you're trespassing, or the terms of agreement when you are in spaces that might not be organically yours. Yeah, I think we should open it up because many of you are media makers or activists, and maybe we can get to a bigger discussion about how do we use media for social change, and how do we create media that's not that sure, yep.
Actually, Amy, do you mind being the mic runner? So when someone asks a question, if you can bring them the mic. We're actually recording this for podcast, and not to intimidate you and make you not want to ask questions. And the podcasts are going to be on the website for the Studio for Media Activism as of next week.
Hi. I was going to ask because as a producer, I also think it's important to be able to tell whatever stories we feel are important. Do you feel like there's a culture of exclusivity around, and you did say that you faced your own criticism when it came to what stories you told and the way you told them. And I do think that storytelling alone is a form of activism because it's a form of education, and education is a path to activism. But how do you feel, especially as a woman of color, how has your journey as a storyteller and as a creator come into contact with difficulties with administrative powers, as opposed to just those, in the case of wanting to screen your work in certain bodies, or as far as getting your work exposed to a certain demographic? Because I know that the danger with media today is that it only showcases what sells, not what tells important stories. A lot of things are profit-driven and not generated based on importance or based on values anymore. And that's what makes people like, students like myself, intimidated to be able to, to cross into that area and be able to discuss anything or challenge anything. So have you come across any of these challenges throughout your career?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We have to recognize the corporatization of mainstream media. And I work in mainstream media. I sell industry documentaries to global, to history television, and I recognize that the storytelling framework, the stories that are that I pitch that are picked up, have a very specific area of what's considered okay, what story, and I struggle with that. And more of my work that I focus on work that obviously I'm not doing home rental shows or Canada's Worst Driver, so there's a certain range of what I can work in, and I kind of have a very cool assessment of it. Some work I see as very commercially viable and innocuous politically. So, for example, the story about Jewish resistance fighters during World War II, because it happened, back then, because it's a story that's widely accepted as a trope, in terms of a struggle, that story has gotten quite a bit of mainstream success, right? But trying to get funding for the migrant women's film that I'm currently working on has been a huge battle. And if you want to tell stories like that and commit to telling stories, you have to be, I think, very recognize the different places which support political voice and start either working in solidarity with them or creating them yourself. I think it's really important because the commercialization of documentary storytelling has, it's been so degraded. And the funding basis has been really eroded, particularly in the Harper years. That now we have pretty much TVO, which is very small budgets, and the NFB, and a few other spaces for feature film documentary storytelling. But in terms of my entry into that as a woman of color, I think you're constantly negotiating that. It's complicated. There's never, I got into media because I never saw myself in media. I never saw my voice. I never saw stories or realities of my family or the communities I grew up in, very working class immigrant family. And I knew that media shaped identity. And it was only, I think, when I was about 18 or 19, the first time I actually consciously read a book written by an Asian woman. It took that long. Maxine Hong Kingston, Warrior Women. I was stunned and floored because I loved reading books. I was a total bookworm as a kid. I just devoured books. But it actually never occurred to me that a book could be written by an Asian woman to tell my story. Can you imagine that, almost 2 decades of living like that and then being shut off to that whole amazing potential of self-expression and sort of, confirmation that you exist and the things that you go through are not only valid, but there are challenges that can be overcome. Anyway, so I think that consciousness around identity and voice and the construction of the empowerment of media is very much what drove me into working in film and television. But you encounter it at every different stage. Whether you're working with new crew who are maybe dismissive because they think they have certain stereotypes of who you are, or whether it's producers who don't want to commission certain stories from you because that's not your natural storytelling area, or whether it's the critique that, why are you telling this story? Or it's never really that. It's never the cost. It's more just a surprise, and I find that always fun.
I think for me, I've got 4 questions about this, right? So first to remember is how is the story constructed, right? So, and who can tell the story? What story is told and whose interest? And I think this is very much the story of the Temporary Foreign Worker Program in Canada. Very much, sure, CBC had its own self-interest in doing what it did, but I think that while, I'm sorry.
So I guess I'll just repeat really quickly. So the 4 questions, I guess, what story is told, whose interest is the story is told, how's the story constructed, and who can actually tell the story. And so what I mean by that is that CBC has done the greatest amount of work to get the story out, but it's also done the most damage to the migrant workers. Very much their story focused on, stealing Canadian jobs, degrading our society, not very much about improving the interests of migrant workers or trying to expand rights for all workers. And this consistent trope is what, recently, just as yesterday, we were dealing with a situation with migrant worker housing in a community just outside of Windsor. And many of us had gone down to talk about the problems of the program itself, making sure that the voices of workers are heard in the decision-making process, talk about the exclusions of different forms of laws and how workers are becoming vulnerable because of that. The community wanted to talk about basically Jamaicans coming to steal your jobs, harass white women, drive down property values, and increase crime. And that very much was a story that got told in trying to prevent the migrant workers from being in the community, not necessarily about, and so what the decision yesterday was we're not going to house the migrant workers in our community or in the particular place, not because of the exploitative conditions they'll face, but because they're a threat to our community. And that's very much what we're seeing all across Canada. So that's the first thing that's really important, how we tell those stories, and making sure it's not actually hurting the people that you're trying to help. Second of all, damn, man, you know how many experts I've come across in the last 15 years? I don't even know who the hell these people are, where they're from. They might have got their degree from Walmart for all I know. But they are right at the front of the picture, being put on TV to talk about these conditions, but they have no flicking clue what the hell they're talking about. And very much, we're talking about, race and gender. And very much, it's not people who are rooted in our communities who are involved in this as well too. And I think there's also particular class interests that we've also have to realize. And the history of living caregivers, as people might know, that many of them are Caribbean women that had worked in our communities. And very much there was class divisions that had happened. Very much a lot of both the middle class and upper middle class Caribbean people looked down on their labor. And we've seen this type of attitude also with the Filipino workers as well too are working. So very much if there's any type of work or organizing that happens, it has to be rooted in the interests of workers. It can't be about selling out or gaining credibility at their expense. And that accountability you talked about is so critical.
Hi, thank you both so much for sharing your work and what you do. My question is actually about these experts that you're talking about on TV. I mean, we are at Ryerson, we're talking in the context of a research hub, and I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the role of academia and academic scholarship.
Well, I'll start, and then Chris, you got to pick up. I have to say, I have found it to be a little bit of a haven right now for me because I'm trying to figure out a refuge from working in the industry. And when I started in documentary, it was for social change. I used to work at CKLN Radio, see Elliot here, and Radical Radio for People's Revolution. You know, we were all about taking media and putting it back in the hands of the people. And then CKLN, the experience of CKLN made me understand the power of media. So then it was El Contrato, and then I went on to make many other documentaries. But about 5 years ago, I realized what was being commissioned from the pitches I put forward were increasingly thinned down storytelling opportunities, and I started thinking I gotta figure out another way to pay the bills, because the economic sort of, the reality of documentary filmmaking is unless you have some kind of wealthy partner, you have some sort of silver spoon, some kind of trust fund, and there are filmmakers, thankfully, who, they're lucky to have that. But if you don't have that and you're actually trying to make a living as a documentary filmmaker, it's a real tough go. And that's when I started, shifting myself and finding space here at Ryerson, because I realized, I can actually still work in my media and make my films, but not be so pressured to sell and pitch and work in that cycle of production, and actually have some kind of stable income, because I hadn't had that for most of my life, and suddenly teaching as a sessional, occasionally I get regular paychecks, and what a relief that is, right? So in terms of academia, that way I actually find it a bit of a safe place to start incubating ideas. And I have to say also, I spent 15 years doing, but not theorizing, and I'm not a heavy on theory, but I also think it's useful to start reflecting on your practice and taking a step back and seeing a bigger picture. And being, I put myself back in school, and going back to school made me appreciate sort of a context that I had never really had time to see that in terms of the historical voice of how culture has been used historically as a voice for change.
So that's a really good question. I want to start actually, a couple months ago I did a talk at Bay State 2, and all these people were there for that one. And I had asked the wrong question, because I'd started off my talk asking two questions. It was the third question I was supposed to ask. And the first question, because sometimes when you're outside of Toronto, you feel that people don't really realize. So the first question I asked everybody is, well, who knows who I am? And everybody's like, yeah. Who knows what Justice for Migrant Workers? And it came up, I think people knew I wasn't trying to be arrogant. I was actually trying to engage people. But there's a big mistake I made. And the mistake I made was to ask the questions, what type of work do we do? And because I think a lot of people may know Justicia, or Justice for Migrant Workers. A lot of people knows about the issues that migrant workers are facing, but the actual organizing, we haven't been able to really tell that story. We haven't done that effectively, I think, as organizers. So, the work, for instance, there was a big racial profiling case where they had 100 workers and forced them to subject to a DNA sweep. How many people know about that? 2. How many people know about the organizing that went into getting parental benefits for employment insurance, parental benefits for migrant workers that resulted in millions and millions of dollars to get benefits and provide some income support for migrant workers? stuff? Okay, cool. Maybe I'll do it in 1 second. All right. How many people know about Adrian Monroe's? A migrant worker who basically was told by his employer that all the black people were monkeys, and monkeys on a vine. And when he stood up against that, he was deported back to St. Lucia. He found his way back to Canada. He took on the employer, and he won, I guess, a big human rights case and won $25,000. Who knows about that case? So part of our fault has been not being, a consistent way of engaging the community about the work that we're doing on the ground. And with respect to academia, what I found is that these stories are being distorted. So it's not about the voices of what's happening here. I'm just using the employment insurance issue. So what had happened was that there was a legal clinic, and people are familiar with the legal clinic system here in Ontario. And there was somebody at the Center for Spanish-Speaking People, Consuelo Rubio, who just like Sook and Winnie and a few other people used to come out to us in the fields. And workers had complained about a whole bunch of different issues, and unemployment insurance was one of them. Yo, why do we have to pay all this money that we don't get any benefits? This is just whack. And so we realized the restrictions after doing our homework around regular benefits under employment insurance. But Consuelo, being the superstar smart person that she is, realized that the same obstacles, the same residency requirements to getting baby benefits or sickness benefits didn't exist. And working with both a worker and actually an employer, they were able to go through some loopholes and to get the first set of baby benefits. And then that was used to get benefits for thousands of other workers. And for us, particularly for me and the Caribbean workers that I work with, that was an organizing tool. One, to talk about the history of unemployment insurance. Two, to build concrete, tangible goals by showing you can get benefits. Three, to build trust. And four, to cause havoc, right? And to get people involved in different parts of resisting on the ground. And every time I read about employment insurance or any of these other issues I talk about, that's never there. It's very much talked about the dominant bodies. It's talked about labor unions. They may mention justice for migrant worker. They may mention other academics. But the important work that people on the ground are doing are never reflected in the work. So I think for all of you who are doing grad work, for all of us who are trying to theorize this stuff, this is our challenge. How do we be as real as possible to the people who are on the ground? We've engaged in different marches, for instance, to bring up these type of issues, and this tremendous resistance that workers took, and the sacrifices they took, too. That also hasn't been reflected, I think, in a lot of the work as well, too. So I think that's the concern, that when we're looking at theorizing particular bodies, there's particular narratives and particular ways that the stories are told to gain credibility, to gain that expertise. And when those parts of the story don't benefit or don't lead to anything else, those are basically discarded. And I think for all the work that we're doing, right, the documentary arose because of Theodoro and a few of those other workers trying to fight against physical abuse by their supervisor. They wanted them to take a stand to fight back. Right? The different projects and the people that you're working with right now, we're seeing the same type of resistance, right? And it's up and down. It's not typically about romanticizing. There's really great moments of resistance, and there's some really shitty stuff, right, that happens in the middle of organizing. And I think that's what's so important about this, and that's the accountability that we need, or that we have to have.
You spoke a little bit about how some of the stories and some of the scenes that were in El Contrato were shot because the workers told you that, these are things you should be filming. I was curious as to what extent the workers had influenced you in determining what stories you put in the film and what didn't, because I'm assuming there's a lot of stuff that ended up on the cutting room floor. I was wondering just if they had any influence or what influence they had.
To the degree where, no, not to the degree where I would ask them, is this scene in, is this scene out? Not like that, no. Is that what you're asking?
No, it's more to what, when you were in the field and when you were shooting with them, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, how did you deal with what you wanted to say and what you thought were the interesting stories, and how did you manage that with what you thought what needed to be told or what they might have wanted to see in the film?
I think the reality is, obviously I have my POV, my point of view, my perspective, my biases, my expectations. And I think truthfully, your job is to have those, recognize those, own that, but then also be true to what's happening in front of you. So ultimately, the story that was told in El Contrato was what was dominant in Teodoto's life when I was shooting with him that season, which was the situation with the supervisor, assaulted one of his coworkers, and then Teodoto was identified as a troublemaker, and then he had to figure out a way to move farms, and he couldn't. Just that story emerged, and I had to just follow the puck, stay with it, right? In terms of the emphasis on the family, I think that's something you glean when you're there, because you're honest to, this is why these workers are here. And I put a big emphasis on family, because that's what I knew that was a motivating force to be working here. And it's interesting because the film is punctuated with diary letters back home, where the men tell the family back home a little bit about what life is like here in Canada. And I remember that day when we were shooting that, I was feeling, I'd really like to figure out a way to make that connection. I guess it was pre-Skype and all that stuff, right? And yeah, we had payphones. People didn't have the smartphones they have now. Because a lot of workers now do Skype every night. And I was working, the NFB had put a professional crew with me that were more experienced, because their assessment was, novice filmmaker, she's going to need a lot of support, need a lot of help. And the shooter I was working with, very experienced older man in the industry. I worked with a number of shooters, but this particular shooter. And he had a very formulaic CBC kind of way that he would want to tell the story. And this one particular day, I was like, what I'd like to do is set up a small camera in one of the bedrooms and invite Teodoto and his co-workers to talk to the camera, and I'll record those letters. I will actually send them back home to their families, so their families can have that. We FedExed it in a few days. But I'll also ask if I can use parts of that in the film storytelling. And they were very enthusiastic. And not just them, they called all their friends. So there's many, many other workers who weren't in the film who did video letters. It was a really special moment. But I remember the professional camera person I was working with was a great shooter. And I learned a lot about shooting in the field with him. I was really dismissive about that. Kind of snorted, actually. That's not documentary. And being challenged, your choices, I think filmmaking or creating media in any way is a confidence game. Half of it is just to say, I can do it, and then bluff it, and then you just make the mistakes that you do, right? And that kind of sort of undermining, I think I'm actually probably answering your question more, just about the challenges you face. But I also think the emphasis of the storylines in the film ultimately was, I hope, a true reflection of what workers, felt were important to them.
Okay, and then I wanted just to play Tale in Toronto, which is a 5-minute short that filmed with Teodoto recently, just a few years ago. We could do that.
Hi, I was wondering if you could walk us through a little bit of what it was like to sort of begin your work on El Contrato, like what the pre-production process was like, and maybe what it was like when you first started filming.
Yeah, that's a lot of research, a lot of hanging out, a lot of being there, building relationships. Like I said, going there originally was with Chris. And then with Chris and the other members of Justicia, being introduced to what was going on and some of the key players, and understanding, okay, this is... And then I met Teodoto through, she's a teacher at University of Windsor, Tanya Basic. Tanya Basic knew Teodoto already, and so she introduced me to him. So if you're asking about sort of the formal stages before production, a lot of it was just building relationships.
Hey, so I have two questions, and if you can only answer one, that's fantastic.
The films are sort of beautiful examples of alternative media in action, so it's really great to see them. I was wondering, to what extent do you think local media plays in shaping these stories? And if you work with, you referenced to the example, I think it was of the Windsor Star. Yeah. Are there other examples in your work where you've actually partnered with local media in helping to shape those stories? And then my second question, if you can squeeze in, it would be great, is to what extent do you see all of your work, the body of work, in conversation with one another? Do the films, I know they each have their own distinct narratives, but is there something that each of them together, is there a larger story?
Yeah, I mean, I think the larger story is social justice. Yeah. Right? And then some dominant themes: migration, citizenship, identity, resistance. But in terms of local media, that's a really interesting question, because earlier I was saying it's easier to tell a story that's super far away from you and start pointing fingers, but when you don't feel the ripple effects of your voice impacting in your own living room. And I think local media is in many ways circumscribed by that proximity to the industry, because the employers in certain industries that hire foreign workers have a very dominant voice in the economic engine of certain small communities that I'm not going to name right, but I think you know what I'm saying. And so that the way in which the reporting happens is very muted in certain situations. The print reporting, the radio reporting, the words that are used to describe the situation, it's more in parentheses or question marks. Is this possibly happening, as opposed to this is happening? You absolutely see an editorial voice. And I haven't actually seen alternative activists, mainstream media, in the regions where the program is dominant. Alternative media in rural areas?
I think there's a couple things, right? The Hampstead deaths, do people remember that? The workers who died in the van crash from about 3 years ago? That's right, yes. There's McDonald's, there's Tim Hortons, and all these particular flashpoints have been, an awakening of what's going on, but they're still seen as an exception, right? They're seen as one particular form of injustice and not reflective or representative of what's actually happening on the ground on a continuous basis. So I think the media itself, there's a conflict where I think some journalists do get it, but they're facing their own pressures internally and aren't able to tell the story. We know, so CBC also had done an expose involved with some of our contacts, and that news report that was aired once on the National was shut down afterwards, and it's never been seen again. You can't find it anywhere. Somebody may have a copy if people want it, but it's not available. You can't get it anywhere. So there is a continued form of censorship that's ongoing, and there is still a fear of telling these stories because of those larger interests, both government as well as powerful corporate interests, right? I think that's also. So I think for all of us, it's about finding those resistance and those points of resistance. How do we bring people together? And I think very much what you're saying about the struggles that you had in dealing with the so-called professionals, right? I think it's the same thing for the organizing. And for all of you here, right? We all have gut instincts. We all want to take risks. And sometimes we can't be afraid of the stuff that we want to do, especially if other people are telling you not to do it. And I think the same rules also go for organizing. Some people may not like the way that we do stuff as the so-called grassroots group, but hey, that's their problem, not ours.
So, Marusi, can I play the 5-minute short? Because I wanted to play this to give an idea of how Teodoro is kind of, still working with filmmakers and Justicia.
Tomorrow we're gonna take Teodoro to a community garden in Parkdale that was started by marginalized youth in the city.
So it's gonna be very interesting to see how youth are trying to take food security into their own hands.
El venir a trabajar acá pues requiere de harto sacrificio y pues cambia uno, ¿no? Forma de pensar. Yo creo que antes pensaba tener un negocio, algo que me iba a hacer de dinero, ahora ya no pienso, ahora ya nomás pienso que tenga yo para comer. Es poco lo que he venido yo aquí a Toronto. Nada más es del aeropuerto a la farma y de la farma al aeropuerto y de noche. Toronto de noche, muy noche.
Toda esta gente está consumiendo toda la comida que tú produces en los restaurantes, está lleno de productos de Livington.
Lo producimos todos, porque no nada más yo, sino todos los trabajadores migrantes.
No,
Pensé que aquí no existía esto.
esto es un muchacho pobre.
Pues sí, pero yo pensé que aquí no existía. Nunca había visto uno. Mira, pensé que estaba yo en México. Voy a dar una moneda de $1. Gracias, amigo. Así, caramba, nunca pensé que hubiera esto. Y menos en este país. Supuestamente sabemos que estamos en un país de primer mundo. Aquí todo es bien, la economía es, si no a 100%, pues a un 80%. Estable, pero nos damos cuenta que no es cierto.
Jardín de Esperanza. This is Teodoro.
Hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
On the way here, we were talking about how a lot of the migrant workers in their farms, they'll have their own garden, and they usually plant, food that they don't have access to. I don't think he's ever seen an urban garden like this.
There's about 200 people that use this garden. Each plot belongs to a different group.
We have a potluck for people in the neighborhood. We were having a problem with budgeting for food for a kitchen.
People really wanted to learn how to grow food.
Showing the community that you don't have to pay these outrageous prices for these vegetables.
Algo que es bien importante para la comunidad es la seguridad de la comida.
Y esto es 100% seguro. Por eso es mejor tener un pedazo de tierra y no un montón de dinero. Porque el dinero no te lo puedes comer. Wow.
I used to never eat vegetables at all. So I would only eat meat, and I've learned to eat vegetables for healthy reasons. I make a beautiful barbecue sauce and hot sauce. So all the jalapenos and all the spicy peppers, we're gonna make our own hot sauce from scratch.
So, do you want to sell that sauce?
Yes,
He does.
I'm selling that sauce.
We get it.
Feel the burn hot sauce. Does he have any ideas how to make a pepper sauce?
Especial, ¿verdad? Esperamos un especial. Yo pienso que no son pobres, yo pienso que son ricos porque tienen un gran pensamiento y tienen aquí el alimento que todos lo quisiéramos tener en casa, ¿verdad? Entonces no son pobres. Quítense de la mente que ustedes están pobres, tienen todo aquí. Una cuchara, préstame.
I can handle spice.
Como mexicano.
I like it.
Why poverty? Ask why.
Thank you so much to Min Sook Lee and Chris Ramsarup for your work. And thanks to all of you for your comments and discussion. And please come to our next event on March 12th and do sign the mailing list on your way.